sure you've all had this experience. Whether you are a storyteller or a writer or a cook or a construction worker or a farmer, whatever it is that fuels your work, people say to you that makes you work, why do you do it? How did you start doing whatever that may be? Why do you keep doing it? Time and again, I've been asked, how did you become a storyteller? Why do you keep doing it? Because really, it's probably not the most consistent of ways to make a living. Some of you here know that. Well, my answer varies. Sometimes I tell them the simple truth that I just love stories. Other times I will tell them about when I met Brother Blue, whom some of you know, who's an amazing storyteller. And the first time I met him and told him a story, he came up to me and he said, "You have the power," which seemed like both a gift and a terrible responsibility. But this is, I think, closer to the truth. My mother was a children's librarian. She's now retired. So I grew up hearing the stories that she was going to tell in her library. She would practice them with me, these folk tales, and I would tell them to all of my friends. But what I didn't share with them were the moments with my father. Now, my father was an aspiring writer. He was a man who loved language. I'm sure that much of my passion for words comes from him. We would walk through the woods or through the cities, and he would tell me the words for all of the different things. He would hold my hand. I was tiny, and I would repeat them back to him. Of course, in this moment, I can't remember any of the more wonderful ones. Does anyone here remember the name of the maple seed that you can stick on your nose? It has a real name. We'll go with that one. Pollywog, he would say, and I would echo back, Pollywog. But the magic happened in the long afternoons. My mom worked long hours. My father was a stay-at-home dad before stay-at-home dads were a thing. And I would come home from kindergarten or first or second grade, and if I was very lucky, he would say, "Come here, I have a story for you." We would lie down on my parents' bed and we would wiggle our toes back and forth because that was always part of how it started. That was where the magic came from, he said. It comes from your feet. And then he would tell me maybe one of the stories that he heard when he was a boy. He only had radio when he was a boy, so he told me stories about the Green Hornet and Cato. Sometimes he would tell me scary stories from Inner Sanctum, but my favorites were when he told me stories about the shadow. Who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men? The shadow knows. And I, at 5 years old, next to him would say, "Who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men?" He would tell me these grand adventures, or he would tell me stories of Mimi and Laura. Now, I have to tell you that they both were me. I'm sure this is no shock to you. But the name Mimi came about because my father would tease me. I bet some of you had fathers who teased you the same way. He would look at me and he would say, "Is your name Gertrude?" "No." "Is your name Henrietta?" "No." "Is your name Aloysius?" "No, my name is Laura." "Well, who's Laura?" "Me, I'm Laura." "Well, who's me?" "Me, Mimi." And so the stories of Mimi and Laura were born as they had adventures around the world prospecting for black gold. Now, I'm sure many of you don't know this because I certainly didn't. I thought black gold was some kind of amazing metal, but it was, of course, you know this here in Texas, oil. So my father told me all of these stories. He told me stories of his boyhood. He told me stories of my own birth. I was tiny. I was 3 pounds when I was born. And so he would told me of holding me with my head in his hand and my feet not even reaching the crook of his elbow. And as we would tell these stories, the light in the room would start to shift. What had started out as bright, late afternoon light would become gold. And the dust motes would shimmer and shiver in the air. And I asked him once what those were, and one time he said to me they were fairies. And I asked him once what those were, and another time he said to me that they were seeds for every story. And I asked him once what they were, and he asked me to tell him instead. And I told him a story, with that golden light flooding in around us. And gradually the room would get darker and darker, and usually we would fall asleep. When we woke, he would say, all right, it's time to wiggle your toes again. And we would wiggle our toes. You can do this with me if you want. We would wiggle our toes, and all of a sudden, the story magic would lift. He would turn on the light with a snap, and the room would be full of incandescent light, still warm, but nothing like the sunlight that had filled the room what seemed like moments before. I grew up. And those stories that my father told to me and the ones I began to tell back to him, they faded between us. And it seemed like no bridge could cover that gulf between us. My father and I, we no longer spoke gentle words. We no longer spoke of fairies and story seeds and magic. Instead, when we spoke, it was careful and polite. A few years ago, my father was diagnosed with heart disease, and pretty quickly it became clear that he was going to die. And so I began to travel back and forth from my home in the middle of the country to New Jersey to spend time with him, because that, of course, is what you do when someone you love, even if it's difficult, is on their way out of this world. And at first we would sit there and we started to talk back and forth in ways that we hadn't for years. He told me stories about his childhood. I told him stories that I remembered from mine. I told him some of the fairy tales that I tell from stage. And for the first time in my life, he would pat my hand and he'd say, "You're not bad at that, kid." And then when he couldn't speak any longer, we watched baseball together. And I told him stories about Babe Ruth, because Babe Ruth was my hero when I was a child. And then when he couldn't even do that, I sat in the bedroom with him and I held his hand. And I told him stories of him telling me stories. The light in the room shifted from the hard white light of midday down through the golden light, and the room began to get darker and dimmer. My mother, lying beside my father on the bed, had her arms wrapped around him. And finally, when I came to the end of a story, I said, "And they lived as best as they could." He squeezed my hand. And a few moments later, he left the room as the light faded away. Not long after, my mother and I were talking between ourselves about my father. We were remembering him and telling stories about him, about the good times and the bad, because those should be remembered too. And then soon we began to tell stories about all the other people we loved who have left this world and gone on to their next adventure. And we were laughing and crying and crying and laughing, and I know my cheeks were wet and they hurt with the strain of my smiles. And I looked at my mom, and she leaned over, she patted my hand, and she said, "That is why we tell stories. For bridges, for memory, and for love." Thank you.